Sups everybody, Mr. Sups here back with more homework for the evolution of video games. When we last left the industry, it just came crumbling down. But here we're talking about how it really survived in the post-crash, pre-Nintendo environment. Now, how it mostly survived was due to two things: PC gaming and Electronic Arts. So, PC gaming first. Around this time, PCs were starting to enter the home. There are multiple models and companies that had them, but I can't really think of them at the top of my head. But I know that there was like the Apple II, which everyone remembers, and the Commodore 64. Now, Commodore 64 beat out Apple II, mainly because it had that PC gaming element to it. And it really pushed it too. Like, there was a trade-in thing. Like, you can take your old 2600 in and you can get some numbers off of that price tag, and it was also kind of cheaper, but still, video games, important, good. But another reason why PC gaming really helped the Western video game industry survive was video games still really had this negative stigma attached to them. Back then, there were still society's ills belong and all, root in the game and all that stuff. But
when little Bobby, he needed a computer to do his math,
you know he would want his mom to get a Commodore 64 because, oh yeah, Mom, that does math so much better. Oh, and it also has games, and I really want to play those things. So that's how the Commodore 64 PC gaming really helped the industry survive. And then we go into Electronic Arts. Now, I can kind of feel a lot of people just cringing when I say EA, just name, and a lot of people in the class did. And we had a very big discussion, and a lot of people didn't really like EA, which I find funny because we're all based in Orlando, and if we are going to continue to be based in Orlando with our game design degrees, guess who we're going to be working for? What we really hit upon was that what EA is now is not what they were then. They had a very different philosophy and a very different person at the helm. That guy was called Trip Hawkins. And that winning smile. Now, that winning smile got a lot of trust out of people in an industry that nobody had trust in. Video games were dead in the West, as we really the root of this episode is about. But a lot of people trusted him, so they worked for him. They gave him capital. God. And even then, the whole sort of image of EA wasn't like this big giant corporation that everyone works for now, that everyone has to deal with now, even if they don't want to now. Kind of what people were getting at. Now, they really tried to push an image at EA, and they did this in several ways. Like, they had album art covers for their covers, and they also had big names sort of sign on. It's kind of like first time that actually happened in the video game industry, and although it's not really big right now, it has worked for them. They have games like One-on-One, Dr. J and Larry Bird Face Off, which was a basketball game, very popular one, and also Madden, which continues to run to this day. And on all honesty, that's what really kept video games going in the West during those periods. And then next class we're getting into Nintendo. But the discussion's really going to start here. The discussion here was to go and find an article about how Nintendo shaped and continues to shape the industry, and not only that, like the world at large. And it's actually a lot more than a lot of people realize. So we had to go and find an article on the subject, so I found this one on the BBC. While the article is really more about the passing of Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi, who was the president during the time that we're discussing in class, it really goes into Nintendo's history from before Yamauchi and how he shaped it into the sort of juggernaut that it is today. And it does also go into how Nintendo shaped the industry and how it continues to shape the industry and the world at large. Good article. Let's start out with the history of Nintendo. It is an old company, founded in 1889 as a playing card manufacturer, and as the times changed, so too did the company. It eventually got into toys, and through that, games, and it had successful products like the Game & Watch and the Famicom. And it was Yamauchi who made the decision that he wanted to market it into America. And I really like what the article has to say about this. But for me, the most significant decision he ever made, the one that really transformed video gaming, was to ignore the analytics, the retail chains, and the advice of consumer focus groups who told him that no one in the USA wanted to buy game consoles anymore. It was 1984, and Yamauchi was hoping to replicate the success that Nintendo's Famicom console had been enjoying in Japan in the USA. But the year before, the video game boom driven by Atari's VCS console and Space Invaders burst. The US gaming industry imploded. Companies crashed, retailers were left with unsold stock, and consumers lost interest. By the time Nintendo started touting its game console, rebranded as the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, for the US and European markets, everyone had consigned game consoles to dustbins of history, as little more than a brief fad. But despite the naysayers, Yamauchi insisted on pushing ahead with the launch of the console, convinced that if game players in Japan loved it, Americans would too. History proved Yamauchi right. By 1989, the NES had become such a success in the USA that Nintendo products accounted for 23% of all toy sales in the country, and the company had overtaken Honda and Toyota to become Japan's most profitable business. Great quote. But that's not the only way that Nintendo really shaped the industry back then. They had very tight controls on what games were and were not getting released. Like last episode, I was talking about a lot of just shovelware and a lot of games that didn't have any right to exist, like Custer's Revenge and Chase the Chuck Wagon. Nintendo did not allow those type of games to come out. For one, they imposed rules on who and who could not develop on their console, but they also barred things like graphic depictions of death, nudity, swearing, a lot of religious stuff as well, which really did kind of stick with video games, those taboo subjects that we just don't touch, until about, I don't know, like the PS2 era with Grand Theft Auto, I would say. But there was another thing that the article points out that I personally didn't think of, and I'm really glad that it did, was Pokemon. Now, Pokemon is huge, was huge, still very huge, it's huge, Pokemon. But the article specifically points out that if it wasn't for Pokemon, a lot of Japanese culture in the form of animation and comics would not make it to the West. And I know that a lot of people don't hold the Pokemon anime in high regard. The fact that it was the conduit for everything else to kind of come in, it really does help highlight how important Nintendo is to things outside of gaming and sort of like entertainment as a whole. So with all this, it really just goes to show and highlight how important Nintendo is, not just for the history of video gaming, but or even just gaming in and of itself, just for the world. How important the NES coming over was. How important Mario and Donkey Kong is to the world of entertainment that we know today.